55-gallon oil drum. Old-timey home washboard. Literal garbage.
And then I found a garden hoe to hoe the vegetables with. That's this part. And then I found me this old Ham's beer can. And I got this here barbecue spatula to turn hamburgers over.
These are instruments created out of necessity. If it exists and makes sound, someone will figure out how to make music with it. Here's Metallica with bike horns. With early video games, all the musician had to work with were square, triangle, and sawtooth waves with a noise track for percussion. As we discussed in Chapter 1, this was because of memory limitations. In the wrong hands, this technology was pure hell. Behold, the history of video games, Level 2.
Beep, beep, mother...
But Charlie, this was clearly programmed by a 5-year-old. No, you're right. Old computer music sounded great. But the original song was made using synthesized notes. That's true, but my dad wasn't going to spend the equivalent of a new car so that my video game sounded better. Here's the terrifying music to 1989's Friday the 13th, about a violent psychopath. Yes, it's Old MacDonald, and yes, the action is taking place on a farm. Not only does the music sound awful, but it also seems to not understand the movie it is based upon. I guess by the 6th sequel, Friday the 13th had been around long enough to insert some comedy. Besides sound, there were other limitations. Here is a guitar. It can play 6 notes at the same time. The first home video game console simply could not do that. The Atari 2600 was one of the first and most popular home consoles of all time. It sold 30 million units but could only play 2 notes or voices simultaneously. For this to sound good, you needed a very talented, musically minded programmer. However, in 1984, as games migrated from the arcade to the living room, Atari released Pitfall 2, arguably the best game on that console by a country mile. Most video games were arcade-like and would get more and more difficult, so that eventually you would lose and someone else would put in a quarter. Pitfall 2 had an actual ending, of sorts, and was among the first games to do so. It was also one of the first games to have save points, which was good because the game was a huge maze. Also, your character never died. He just lost progress and points. But the main reason Pitfall 2 was one of the best early home console games was the music. You can easily hear 3 voices. Here's a score to prove it. But that wasn't all. It featured a percussion track and sound effects. Also, it was one of the earliest editions of what's called adaptive music, where the music would react to what the player was doing in the game. How is that even possible on a system that can only play two voices at the same time? Rapidly changing technology and the DPC display processor chip. The display processor chip, or DPC chip, was in the cartridge of the game itself and improved video and audio functionality for the aging Atari 2600. The DPC chip also coincidentally bore the programmer's initials, David Patrick Crane. David Crane was born in Indiana and received an electrical engineering technology degree in 1975 from DeVry University. He co-founded Activision in 1975, and according to his 2013 AMA interview on Reddit, he was a professional foosball player after he graduated college, which was evidently something one could do in the 1970s. Instead of trying to get his image on the world's worst box of Wheaties, he made games. And according to him, game programmers in the late 1970s to early 80s were generally responsible for every pixel, the gameplay, and sound of every video game. Which I guess would explain the person that wrote this. The mere existence of the DPC chip showed the need for a console evolution. What followed was the 8-bit period in video games starting around 1983. There are a few 8-bit consoles out there: Intellivision, ColecoVision, the Atom Computer, the Atari 7800, but only a few cornered the game market in the late 80s. The Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, had 5 voices. The Commodore 64, which was not a games console but a very popular home computer, had 3 voices. And technically, in the 16-bit era, the portable Nintendo Game Boy had 3 voices plus noise. Now, you would think that the NES was automatically the best because it had the most voices. But out of those 5 voices, 2 were permanently square waves, 1 was a permanent triangle wave used mostly for bass, a noise track, and a voice for sampled sounds, which didn't get used often. The Commodore 64 could change synth waves at any time, even switching a track for a split second to create a drum sound, then switch right back to an instrument to fool the listener into thinking they were listening to more voices than the hardware could deliver. In my opinion, the Commodore 64 sounded a lot better, but the debate still rages on. One of the biggest tricks video game composers relied upon was to combat this limitation in voices with the arpeggio, which means broken chord. A good example would be the NBC theme, which hints at G. You can hear this trick a lot in 8-bit games, playing arpeggios at superhuman speeds to sound like there are more notes playing at the same time than there really are. Notice the adaptive music on that game. It speeds up or slows down depending upon the skateboarding character's actions. 8-bit games were beginning to require teams of staff to handle individual tasks. This is where the video game composer became an actual job. So let's talk about one of the all-time best video game composers, Koji Kondo, born 1961. This man was responsible for Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, including Ocarina of Time, and many other universally recognized tunes. He was never trained in composition. He just happened to be really good at it. Hip Tanaka was born in 1957. He was a composer and sound engineer and received his college degree in electrical engineering. Tanaka also had no formal music training except this well-known for its time Japanese reggae band, the Shampoos. He started out making Mario's foot stomp and jump sound effects for Donkey Kong and wrote the music for Metroid. Here's the ending scene that blew everyone's minds at the time. composed Super Mario Land, Kid Icarus, programmed the music for Tetris, and was responsible for developing audio hardware for the iconic Game Boy, also the Game Boy camera and printer. In the late 80s, 16-bit gaming consoles hit the market, opening up a huge array of options for music and video detail in games. The terrible sounding beeps and boops of the 8-bit generation were swept away to the dustbin of history. Well, no, not really. There are whole bands and hobbyists today dedicated to what is called chiptune music, and they're really hardcore about it.
So you want to make chiptune music? Cool.
That is Tiramani VGM. He's actually pretty cool and way more detailed about this particular subject. Definitely check him out if you want to know more about this. Bit systems were a huge technological leap from the 8-bit era.
Excellent. Finish him.
Fourth generation consoles are developed around 1987, with the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo Entertainment System being the most popular by far. This period gave game composers more freedom to create and orchestrate complex music that sounded light years ahead of their predecessors. 16-bit systems could produce multiple voices at once, but again, there were limits even in these newer consoles. There were a lot of talented game composers in this time period, and listing all of them would take a long time, so I'll just mention two of them. Yasunori Mitsuda was born in 1972. He wanted to play golf in high school, but decided instead to pursue music at a junior college in Tokyo. He wrote most of the music to the legendary game Chrono Trigger, among others. But tended to work so hard that he would get sick or pass out. During Chrono Trigger, he gave himself stomach ulcers and had to stop under the advice of doctors. What was left to do was taken up by another high-ranking composer, Nobuo Uematsu, who originally hired him to the team. Nobuo Uematsu, born in 1959, was a self-taught musician from around 11 years old and studied English in college. He played keyboards for several bands and was ultimately hired by Square Software in 1986. He was responsible for the music for the Final Fantasy series, King's Knight, Rad Racer, and 3D World Runner. Probably his best-known work is called Dancing Mad from the game Final Fantasy VI. Full disclosure, during the 16-bit era I was in college doing college things and not playing video games. So a few of my slightly younger friends introduced me to this piece in preparation for this video. After studying it for a while, I can say it's the best video game music I have ever heard. Dancing Mad is the background music for the ending boss battle in Final Fantasy VI. For those who are unaware, a boss battle is usually a very difficult fight, sometimes in multiple stages. These are meant to be challenging as the player would need to study the enemy's tactics and overcome them, causing a new stage where the boss changes in some way one would have to adapt to and fight back against. There can be multiple stages to this fight, but ultimately, if you are good enough, you will win a satisfying victory. This is very similar to the end of an action movie finale. For Final Fantasy VI, Uematsu composed a multiple movement work of art that at times is reminiscent of Baroque composers Handel and Bach, especially in his work on organ, rock, and what sounds to me like a Santana jam. The piece is over 10 minutes long, so I don't have time to play the whole thing, but it's all over the internet and worth your time. If I have one criticism, it goes out to my RPG friends. Look, I liked playing Dungeons & Dragons back in the day as much as anybody, but watching these role-playing video games as an observer is, well, tediously boring. This is why I will say that the music in this example is much more fun to listen to than watching a game where the characters just blink at each other and occasionally throw a fireball or a stick.